Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. There was a time, long before the counting of years became the burden of mortal men, when the world itself was remade. The First Age had ended not in triumph, but in cataclysm. Beleriand, that vast and ancient realm where elves had sung beneath stars older than the sun, was shattered. The fury of the Valar, those powers who shaped the world at its dawn, had broken the earth itself. Mountains collapsed into the sea. Forests that had witnessed the birth of song were swallowed by waves that knew no mercy. The cries of the fallen echoed across the void, and then silence. In that silence, the world exhaled. The great enemy, Morgoth, the black foe of the world, had been cast beyond the walls of night. His servants were scattered or slain. His fortresses crumbled into dust. Yet the victory was bitter, for the price had been written in blood and ash. The elves who remained looked upon the drowned lands and wept. The kingdoms they had built, the beauty they had wrought, the loves they had cherished, all lay beneath fathoms of cold, indifferent water. But the Valar, in their pity and their wisdom, did not leave the world to grief alone. From the depths of the western sea, they raised an island. It rose like a vision, like a dream given form, white cliffs crowned with green hills, harbors deep enough to cradle the ships of heaven, and skies so clear they seemed woven from light itself. This was Númenor, the Westerness, the land of gift. It was given to men, not to all men, but to the Edain, those who had fought beside the elves in the wars against the darkness. They were the faithful, the friends of the firstborn, and their reward was a realm more beautiful than any mortal kingdom before or since. Yet even as Númenor rose, gleaming and proud beneath the sun, something stirred in the ruins of the east. The fires of Angband had been quenched, yes. Morgoth's throne lay empty. But his greatest servant, the one who had been his most cunning lieutenant, his most terrible voice, that one had not been found. He had fled into the wild places, into the shadows where even the eyes of the Valar could not pierce. And there, in the broken lands, he began to gather his strength once more. The Second Age dawned quietly, like a sunrise after a storm. The elves who had survived the wars withdrew into hidden realms, Lindon in the west, Lothlorien beneath the eaves of the Golden Wood, Rivendell cradled in the valley of Imladris. They built no great kingdoms now. Their time, they knew, was waning. The world was changing. The dominion of elves was passing, and the age of men was rising like a tide. But time in those days moved differently. Years stretched long and golden. The seasons turned with a slowness that allowed beauty to deepen, wisdom to grow. The elves, undying and patient, watched the stars and sang their ancient songs. The men of Númenor built their cities of white stone, their towers crowned with eagles, their ships that sailed further than any vessels had dared before. The world breathed again, and for a while, for a blessed, fragile while, it seemed that peace might endure. Yet beneath the surface, like roots twisting deep in poisoned soil, something else was growing. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lay thick and the air itself tasted of ash, a dark tower began to rise. Slowly, stone by stone, fueled by malice and ambition, it climbed toward the sky. And in the heart of that tower, a will awakened, ancient, patient, and utterly without mercy. The world had been broken and remade, yes, but the breaking was not finished. For in the quiet years of peace, while elves sang and men built and the Valar turned their gaze westward to the undying lands, a shadow crept back into Middle-earth. It wore no crown. It commanded no armies, not yet. But it moved with purpose, with a plan forged in the fires of a hatred older than the mountains. And when the time was right, when the pieces were in place, that shadow would speak a single name, a name that would echo through the ages, a name whispered in fear and longing, in hope and despair. Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. The world was young again, yes. The seas had been bent, the lands reshaped, the darkness cast out. But even in victory, even in the light of a new dawn, the seeds of the next darkness had already been sown. Not in the ruins of Angband, not in the ashes of Thangorodrim, but in the heart of a single servant who had not been slain. A whisper carried on the wind, soft as silk, cold as iron. Anatar. Let us turn now to the west, where the waves break against cliffs of white stone, and the gulls cry above harbors carved from living rock. Let us turn to Númenor, the star of the sea, the jewel of mortal realms, the island that stood between the world of men and the realm of the blessed. It was no accident, this gift. The Valor do not act on whim. They had watched the Edain, the fathers of men, fight and die beside the Elves in the wars against Morgoth. They had seen their courage, their loyalty, their willingness to give their lives for a cause greater than themselves. And when the war was won and Beleriand lay in ruins, the Valor did not forget. So they raised Númenor from the sea, and they gave it to the Edain as a dwelling place. And they set upon it their blessing. The first king of Númenor was Elros, son of Eärendil, brother of Elrond. He stood at a crossroads that no other being in all the histories of Arda had faced. For his father was mortal and his mother was elven, and the Valor gave him a choice. The life of the Eldar, undying and bound to the circles of the world, or the life of men, brief and bright, and destined to pass beyond the world into a fate unknown even to the Valor themselves. Elros chose mortality, but the Valor, in their grace, did not let that choice diminish him. They granted him and his descendants a lifespan far beyond that of other men, 3 centuries, sometimes more, in which wisdom could grow deep and vision could reach far. And so Elros became Tar Miniater, the first High King, and under his rule Númenor flourished like a garden in eternal spring. 7 great cities rose upon the island, each more beautiful than the last. Armenilos, the Golden, stood at the heart of the realm, its towers so tall they seemed to pierce the sky. Rōmena, the eastward haven, sent forth ships that explored the coasts of Middle-earth and brought back wonders and knowledge. Anjunia in the west looked always toward the blessed realm, where the light of Valinor still shone beyond the reach of mortals. The Númenorians became the greatest of men. They were tall and strong, with eyes like the sea and voices that could command storms. They were craftsmen without peer, building ships that could ride the wildest waves and halls that echoed with music and learning. They were wise, for they had been taught by the Elves, and they remembered the ancient days when the 2 kindreds had fought side by side. But more than their strength, more than their beauty, it was their hearts that set them apart. They loved the sea and the stars and the green earth. They honored the Valor and gave thanks for the gift they had received. They sailed often to the shores of Middle-earth, not as conquerors but as teachers, bringing knowledge and aid to the lesser men who dwelt there in darkness. For many long years, Númenor was a beacon of hope in a world still scarred by war. Yet even in the beginning, there was a shadow. The Valor had given the Númenorians one command, one boundary they must not cross. They were forbidden to sail west, beyond the sight of their own land, toward the undying lands where the Elves dwelt in bliss and the Valor themselves walked in light. That realm was not for mortals. To seek it was to grasp at a gift not meant for them, And the Valor had given men another gift, one that the Númenorians did not at first understand: death. Not the slow fading of the elves, bound to the world until its ending. Not the curse of undeath that Morgoth had twisted into his servants, but a true departure, a release from the circles of the world, a journey into a mystery beyond even the knowledge of the Valor. Iluvatar, the One, had woven it into the very fabric of mankind. The gift of men, it was called. Freedom from the weariness of unending time. But to mortal eyes, it did not feel like a gift. As the years passed and the generations turned, the Númenorians began to look westward with longing. They saw the elves, who did not age, who could sail to Valinor and walk in the light of the two trees. And they saw themselves, growing old, dying, passing into shadow. Envy crept into their hearts like a slow poison. The gift became a curse in their minds. Death became the enemy. And so the first whispers of rebellion began. The mariners of Númenor, those who had sailed furthest and seen the most, began to speak in quiet voices. Why should we be denied? Why should the elves have immortality and we only this short span of years? Are we not the faithful? Are we not the worthy? The kings began to build monuments, not to Eru Iluvatar, the one who had made all things, but to themselves. Temples rose, not in gratitude, but in defiance. The white sails of Númenor, once symbols of friendship and aid, began to cast long shadows over the coasts of Middle-earth. The island was still beautiful. The cities still gleamed. The ships still sailed. But something had changed, something subtle and deep, like a crack in the foundation of a great tower. And in the silence of their halls, in the privacy of their hearts, the Númenorians gazed westward and found themselves chained by longing. The sea does not forget. The waves remember every ship that sailed them, every prayer whispered over their depths. And they whispered back, in voices only the desperate could hear. Come west, come home. But the sea was lying. Far to the east, where the misty mountains cast their long shadows and the rivers ran silver through green valleys, there was a land called Eregion. It was a realm of the elves, nestled in the foothills, close enough to the dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm that the sound of hammers on stone could sometimes be heard echoing through the hills. It was a place of craft and beauty, where the ancient skills of Valinor had not been entirely forgotten. The elves of Eregion called themselves the Gwaitheimer Dane, the people of the jewel smiths. They were led by Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, bearer of a lineage both glorious and cursed. Feanor, the greatest of all elven craftsmen, had wrought the Silmarils, the three jewels that held the light of the two trees, and in his pride and his grief had brought ruin upon his people. His name was both a legend and a warning. But Celebrimbor did not wish to repeat his grandfather's mistakes. He sought not to capture light, but to preserve it. He wished to create things of beauty that might heal the wounds of the world, that might slow the fading of the elves, and keep alive the memory of the blessed realm from which they had been exiled. So the smiths of Eregion bent their minds and their hearts to their work. They forged rings and amulets, crowns and blades, things of such beauty that even the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, who were not easily impressed, spoke of them with wonder. The friendship between elf and dwarf grew strong in those days, bound by mutual respect and the shared love of craft. And into this place of learning and creation, there came a stranger. He appeared in the year 1200 of the Second Age, though none could say from where he had come. He was fair to look upon, tall and noble, with eyes that gleamed with wisdom and a voice that spoke with the authority of ages. He called himself Anadar, the Lord of Gifts, And he said that he had been sent by the Valor to aid the peoples of Middle-earth in their struggles against the darkness. At first, the elves were wary. Gil-galad, the High King in Lindon, did not trust him. Elrond, wise even in those early days, counseled caution. But Celebrimbor, eager for knowledge, eager to create, welcomed him. And Annatar was generous with his gifts. He taught the smiths secrets they had never known, how to blend metals in ways that made them stronger, how to inscribe runes that would preserve and protect, how to weave enchantments into the very fabric of their creations. He spoke of the power that lay hidden in the earth, in fire, in the secret places of the world. He spoke of a craft that could rival even the works of the Valor themselves. Celebrimbor listened, and he was seduced. Not by greed, not by malice, but by the purest and most dangerous desire of all, the desire to create something truly great, something that would endure when all else had faded. Together, Annatar and the smiths of a region began the greatest work of the age. They forged the rings of power. 19 rings they made in all, each one a masterpiece, each one imbued with strength and subtlety beyond anything crafted before. 9 rings were given to men, who above all else desired power and dominion. 7 were given to the dwarves, who loved craft and treasure and the deep places of the earth. And 3, the greatest of all, were made by Celebrimbor alone, without Annatar's hand upon them, and these were kept by the elves. The work was long and painstaking. Every ring was forged with ritual and intention. Molten gold flowed like rivers of fire. Hammers struck in rhythm with heartbeats. Words of power were whispered over each band, binding it with enchantments of preservation, of command, of dominion. And all the while Annatar watched and smiled. For the elves did not know that even as they worked, even as they poured their hearts and their skill into the rings, he was working in secret. Far to the south, in the land of Mordor, where the fires of the earth burned hottest and the shadows lay thickest, he had built a fortress. Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower it was called, and in the heart of its furnaces he forged a ring of his own. One ring. It was not as beautiful as the others. It bore no jewels, no intricate carvings. It was a simple band of gold, marked only with a script in a tongue no elf had ever spoken, written in letters of fire. But it was mightier than all the others combined. For into that ring, Annatar, who was Sauron, the Dark Lord, the servant of Morgoth, the deceiver, poured his own power. He bound the ring to his very being, so that while it endured, he could not be truly destroyed. And through it, he could command all the other rings, control their bearers, dominate their wills. It was a masterwork of malice, a perversion of the craft the elves had loved, a corruption of the very act of creation. And when the one ring was complete, when Sauron first placed it upon his finger and spoke the words of binding, the elves felt it. In a region, in the midst of their labors, Celebrimbor suddenly stopped. His hands trembled. The ring he was holding, one of the 3, grew cold. And in his mind, like a voice spoken from the depths of a nightmare, he heard the words that Sauron had inscribed upon the one. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The smiths looked at one another in horror. The truth crashed upon them like a wave breaking against stone. They had been deceived. Celebrimbor tore the rings from his hands and hid the 3, swearing that Sauron would never touch them. The other elves cast off their rings as well, refusing to be enslaved. But the men and dwarves who bore the 9 and the 7 were not so quick, not so wise. And one by one, they fell under the shadow of the one. Eregion, that bright realm of craft and friendship, was doomed from that moment. Sauron, revealed at last, marched to war. His armies swept across the land, and Celebrimbor, the last and greatest of the jewelsmiths, was captured. He was tortured for the location of the 3 rings, but he did not break. And when Sauron finally killed him, he hung his body from a pole as a banner of his victory. The age of craft had ended. The age of war had begun. And in the fires of Orodruin, beneath the shadow of Mount Doom, Sauron laughed, for he had bound them all. While war raged in Middle-earth, while the smiths of Eregion fell and the kingdoms of Elves buckled under the weight of Sauron's malice, Númenor stood untouched. The island lay far to the west, beyond the reach of armies, beyond the grasp of darkness. Its white towers still gleamed beneath the sun. Its ships still sailed proudly across the waves. Its people still lived in splendor. But the shadow had already begun to fall. It did not come as an army. It did not come with fire and sword. It came quietly, slowly, like rot creeping through the heartwood of a great tree. It came as a whisper, as a question, as a doubt planted deep in the soul. Why should we die when the Elves do not? The Númenorians had always been proud, but their pride had once been tempered by gratitude. They had honored the valor, remembered the gift, sailed to Middle-earth as friends and teachers. But as the centuries passed, that gratitude began to sour. The kings grew restless. They looked westward toward the undying lands and felt the sting of prohibition. They looked at their own lives, long though they were, and saw only the approach of death. They looked at the Elves, who aged not at all, and envy burned in their hearts like a slow fire. The people of Númenor began to divide. On one side were the faithful, those who still honored the valor, who still gave thanks for the gift of Iluvatar, who still sailed to Middle-earth in friendship. They were led by the lords of Anjunia, a noble house in the west of the island. Amandil was their leader in those days, a man wise and foresighted, who saw the darkness gathering and grieved for what was to come. On the other side were the king's men, those who had turned their hearts away from the valor, who resented the ban, who saw death not as a gift but as a curse. They grew in number and in power, and their voices grew louder in the councils of the king. And the kings themselves began to change. They no longer took their names in the Elvish tongue, as their fathers had done. They took names in the language of men, claiming dominion over their own fate. They built great monuments to themselves, tombs and temples, as if stone could outlast the doom of mortality. They looked with disdain upon the Elves, whom they had once revered. And they looked with greed upon Middle-earth, where lesser men might be ruled and dominated. The ships of Númenor no longer came as friends. They came as conquerors. And in the year 3262 of the Second Age, when Ar-Pharazôn the Golden took the throne, the shadow over Númenor became complete. Ar-Pharazôn was the mightiest of all the kings of Númenor, tall and proud and beautiful, a warrior without equal, a king who demanded absolute dominion. He heard that Sauron, the Dark Lord, had proclaimed himself king of men in Middle-earth, and his pride could not endure it. So he gathered the greatest fleet Númenor had ever assembled and sailed east to challenge Sauron in his own land. The army of Númenor was so vast, so terrible in its splendor, that even Sauron's servants fled at the sight of it. The banners of the Sea Kings covered the hills of Mordor like a golden sea. The trumpets of Númenor shook the very foundations of Barad-dûr. And Sauron, seeing that he could not stand against such might, did not fight. Instead, he surrendered. He came forth from his tower, clad in fair form, and knelt before Ar-Pharazôn. He called him the greatest of kings. He praised his strength, his wisdom, his glory. And he allowed himself to be taken back to Númenor as a prisoner, a hostage. a trophy of victory. But it was a trap. Sauron had learned well from his master, Morgoth. He knew that the mightiest fortress could be overthrown from within. He knew that pride was a weapon sharper than any blade. And he knew that the Númenorians, for all their strength, were mortal, and mortals could be corrupted. Within 3 years, Sauron had become the most trusted counselor of the king. His chains were golden, yes, but they were ornaments, not bindings. He walked freely in the courts of Armanelos. He whispered in the ears of lords and ladies. He spoke of the injustice of death, of the tyranny of the valor, of the power that could be claimed if only they dared to reach for it. And the Númenorians listened. Slowly, horribly, the island began to change. The white tree of Númenor, the symbol of the faithful, the gift of the elves, was neglected. Its leaves turned brown. Its branches withered. And in its place, in the courtyards of the king, a new temple was built. It was a temple to Melkor, to Morgoth, the enemy of the world, the black foe who had been cast into the void. Sauron taught the king to worship him, not as a defeated enemy, but as a god of freedom, a liberator who had dared to defy the tyranny of the valor. And upon the altar of that temple, blood was shed. At first, it was only criminals. Then it was enemies of the king. Then it was the faithful, those who still clung to the old ways, who still honored Eru and the valor. They were hunted, persecuted, burned alive as offerings to the dark. The air over Armanelos grew thick with smoke. The white stones of the city were stained with soot and blood. The laughter that had once echoed in the halls was replaced by whispers of fear and the crackling of flames. The faithful fled to the west, to the haven of Romena, where they built ships in secret and prepared for the end they knew was coming. Amandil, their leader, saw the doom approaching like a storm on the horizon, and he made a desperate plan. He would sail west. He would go to Valinor itself to plead with the Valor for mercy, to beg them to intervene before Númenor destroyed itself entirely. He told his son, Elendil, to prepare, to build ships, to gather the faithful, to be ready to flee when the time came. And then Amandil sailed into the west and was never seen again. Meanwhile, in the courts of Armanelos, Sauron spoke his final poison. He told Ar-Pharazôn that the Valor had lied, that the Undying Lands were not forbidden because they were sacred, but because they held the secret of immortality, a secret the Valor wished to keep for themselves. If the king were to sail there, if he were to set foot upon those shores and claim them by force, he could seize that immortality for himself. He could become a god. And Ar-Pharazôn, mad with pride and fear of his own approaching death, believed him. He commanded the greatest armada ever assembled. Ships beyond counting, soldiers beyond number. The entire might of Númenor was bent toward a single purpose: to invade the Undying Lands and tear immortality from the hands of the Valor. The faithful watched in horror as the fleet gathered in the harbors. They saw the black sails raised, the trumpets sounded, the oars dipping into the water like the legs of some monstrous insect. And they knew that the end had come. And when the king, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, commanded his fleet to sail west, the sea itself trembled. There are moments in the history of the world when the very fabric of existence holds its breath, when the Valor themselves pause in their labors and turn their eyes toward a single point, a single choice, a single act that will echo through all the ages to come. This was such a moment. The fleet of Ar-Pharazôn left the shores of Númenor in the year 3319 of the Second Age. The trumpets that sounded from the harbors were so loud they could be heard across the entire island. The sails, black and gold, stitched with the emblems of eagles and stars, covered the sea like a shroud. There were so many ships that the water between them could not be seen. The oars beat in unison, a rhythm like the heartbeat of some vast and terrible beast. And at the prow of the foremost ship stood Ar-Pharazôn, clad in armor of silver and gold, his crown gleaming like a sun, his face set with the grim determination of one who believes he is beyond judgment. Behind him, in the harbor of Romena, the faithful watched. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, stood upon the decks of their own ships, 9 vessels, small and fragile compared to the armada, but laden with the treasures and the memories of the people who still honored the light. They did not sail west. They waited. They watched. They prayed. For days, the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn sailed. The winds were calm, the sea smooth as glass. It was as if the world itself dared not resist him. The king stood at the prow and looked westward, and his heart swelled with triumph. He was the greatest of all kings. He would claim the undying lands. He would become immortal. And then, on the horizon, he saw it. A light, not the light of the sun, but something deeper, older, purer. The light of Valinor itself, the light of the 2 trees that had illuminated the world before the sun and moon were made. It shone like a promise, like a beacon, like a doorway into eternity. The fleet surged forward. The ships ran aground on the shores of Ammon, the blessed realm. The soldiers of Númenor leaped onto the white sands and raised their banners. They shouted in victory. They had done what no mortal had ever done. They had reached the undying lands by force. And then the world broke. There was no thunder, no warning. The sky simply split. A voice spoke not in words, but in a presence so vast and so terrible that every living being in Middle-earth felt it in their bones. It was the voice of Eru Ilúvatar, the one, the creator who had not intervened in the world since its making. He spoke once, and once was enough. The sea opened beneath the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn. It did not sink his ships, it swallowed them. The waters rose up like walls, like the jaws of some unimaginable beast, and then closed over the armada as if it had never been. The ships, the soldiers, the king himself, all were dragged into the depths, into the abyss, into a darkness from which there would be no return. And then the wrath of Eru turned upon Númenor itself. The island shook. The mountains that had stood since its raising cracked and split. The towers of Armanelos, those proud spires that had reached toward the heavens, crumbled like sand. The earth groaned and buckled. The sea surged inward, pouring over the cliffs, over the cities, over the fields and the forests and the temples where blood had been spilled. Fire erupted from the heart of the island. The mountain called Meniltarma, the pillar of heaven, where the kings of old had offered prayers to Eru, exploded in a column of flame and ash that rose to touch the sky. The sound was like the breaking of the world itself. The people of Númenor ran. They screamed. They prayed. But there was nowhere to run, no refuge, no salvation. The sea claimed them all, the king's men who had worshipped Morgoth, the innocents who had known no better, the children who had never chosen the path of their fathers. The island sank. Slowly at first, then faster, faster, as if the earth itself were eager to be rid of it. The harbors filled with water. The streets became rivers. The great halls where kings had feasted and minstrels had sung filled with the cold, silent dark. And then, with a sound like a sigh, Númenor was gone. The sea closed over it. The waves settled. The sky cleared as if nothing had happened. Where the greatest realm of men had stood, there was now only water, deep, endless, and unforgiving. The Valor wept. Not for the king's men, not for the proud and the corrupt, but for the beauty that had been lost, for the potential that had been squandered, for the gift that had been thrown back in the face of its giver. And in their grief, they made a final change to the world. They bent the seas. Before that day, the world had been flat. A ship sailing west could, if it dared, reach the undying lands. But now the Valor took Ammon and Eressëa, the blessed realm and the Isle of the Elves, and removed them from the circles of the world. They placed them beyond reach, beyond sight, beyond the paths that mortals could walk. The world became round, and the straight path to Valinor was closed to all save the elves alone. Middle-earth remained, bent and broken. And upon its shores, in the midst of the chaos and the terror, 9 ships arrived from the east. They were battered, their sails torn, their hulls scarred by storm and wave. But they were intact. And upon them were the survivors, Elendil the Tall, and his sons Isildur and Anarion, and the remnant of the faithful who had fled before the doom. They had been saved by the grace of Eru, carried east by winds that no mortal hand could have summoned. They looked back toward the west, toward the place where Númenor had been, and saw only empty sea. And they wept, but they did not despair, for they carried with them the memory of the island. They carried seedlings from the white tree. They carried the Palantiri, the seeing stones. They carried the shards of Narsil, the sword of Elendil. And they carried the knowledge that even in ruin, even in exile, the light could endure. They came to Middle-earth not as conquerors, but as refugees. And there, in the shadow of Sauron's rising power, they would build new kingdoms. Kingdoms founded not on pride, but on remembrance. Not on dominion, but on hope. But that tale would come later. For now, there was only silence. The silence of the sea, the silence of the drowned, the silence of a world that had been irrevocably changed. And in the wreckage of his fortress, in the ruin of Barad-dûr, Sauron stirred. His body had been destroyed in the downfall, consumed by the cataclysm he himself had helped to bring about. But his spirit endured, dark and patient and filled with hate. The survivors came ashore at the mouth of a great river, where the waters of the Anduin met the sea. The land was wild, empty, scarred by war and shadow, but it was land, solid, real, and for the faithful who had watched their homes sink beneath the waves, it was enough. Elendil stood upon the shore and looked eastward, toward the mountains that rose in the distance. He was weary beyond measure, weary in body, weary in soul. His father Amandil was lost. His homeland was gone. His people were scattered and grieving, but he did not falter. He was the High King now, the last of the line of Elros, and upon him rested the burden of leadership. He raised his sword Narsil, the blade forged in the First Age, the sword that had belonged to kings, and he spoke an oath. He swore that the faithful would not fade into obscurity. They would build. They would endure. They would remember. And so the kingdoms in exile were founded. In the north, in the lands that had once been green and fair before Sauron's malice had scarred them, Elendil established the realm of Arnor. Its capital was Anúminas, a city built upon the shores of Lake Evendim, where the waters were clear and the stars reflected like silver coins. It was not Númenor. Nothing could be Númenor, but it was beautiful in its own way, a testament to the skill and the sorrow of those who had survived. In the south, his sons Isildur and Anarion built the kingdom of Gondor. They raised 2 great cities, Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, which looked eastward toward Mordor, and Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, which stood guard over the fertile plains of the west. Between them, in the valley of Osgiliath, they built their capital, a city of bridges and gardens, where the river Anduin flowed broad and deep. The exiles brought with them the treasures of Númenor. The Palantiri, the seeing stones, were placed in the towers of both kingdoms, allowing the kings to see across vast distances and to speak with one another even when separated by miles. The seedling of the white tree saved from the ruin of Armanelos, was planted in the court of Mina's Anor, and it grew strong and fair, a living symbol of the light that had not been entirely extinguished. But more than treasures, the exiles brought memory. They built their cities in the style of Númenor, white stone, tall towers, arched doorways, and wide plazas. They spoke the Elvish tongue, Sindarin, which they had learned from the Eldar, and they taught it to their children. They honored the valor once more, and they gave thanks to Eru Ilúvatar for the mercy that had spared them. Yet even in their building, even in their hope, they could not forget the shadow. To the east, Mordor loomed. Sauron had survived the downfall, his body destroyed, yes, but his spirit clinging to the world through the power of the One Ring. He had fled back to Barad-dûr, and there, slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. His form was diminished, no longer fair, no longer capable of deceit. But his will was as strong as ever, and his malice burned like a fire that could never be quenched. The exiles knew that peace could not last. Elendil looked to the elves for counsel and for aid. In Lindon, Gil-galad still ruled, the last high king of the Noldor in Middle-earth. He was wise and mighty, a warrior who had fought in the wars of the First Age and borne witness to the fall of kingdoms. He welcomed the exiles, for he remembered the ancient friendship between Elf and the Edain. And in Rivendell, in the hidden valley of Imladris, Elrond Half-Elven offered sanctuary and wisdom. He had chosen the fate of the elves when his brother, Elros, had chosen mortality. But he loved the descendants of his brother still, and he grieved for the doom that had befallen them. Together, elves and men formed a new alliance. They called it the Last Alliance, for they knew, even then, that this would be the final great struggle between the light and the dark. Sauron's power was growing. His armies were mustering. His will was bent toward one goal, the domination of all Middle-earth. The exiles fortified their cities. They built watchtowers along the borders of Mordor. They trained their soldiers and forged weapons in the ancient style. Gondor became a bastion of strength, a bulwark against the darkness. And in the north, Arnor stood as a beacon of the old wisdom, a reminder of what had been lost and what still might be saved. But even as they prepared for war, the exiles lived in sorrow. They were a people in mourning. They had lost their homeland, their king, their way of life. The songs they sang were songs of lament. The stories they told were stories of the sea, of the white shores of Númenor, of the towers that had fallen. Every stone they laid, every tree they planted was a memorial. And yet, in that sorrow, there was also a strange kind of hope, for they had been humbled. The pride that had destroyed Númenor was gone, burned away in the fires of its downfall. The exiles did not seek dominion. They did not grasp for immortality. They knew now what the Númenorians had forgotten, that the true gift was not eternal life, but the courage to live fully in the time that was given. They were mortal. They would die. Their kingdoms would fade, as all things must. But while they endured, they would stand against the darkness. They would remember the light. They would honor the gift. And in the east, in the black land of Mordor, Sauron felt their resolve. He felt the strength of the elves and the will of men. And he knew that the time for waiting was over. The fires of Barad-dûr rekindled. The forges of Mordor roared. The armies of the shadow began to march. But in the hidden places of the world, in the councils of the wise, a plan was forming. A last, desperate gamble. An alliance that would either save Middle-earth or see it fall into ruin forever. For in the east, the fires of Mordor rekindled, and the eye opened once more. There are wars that are fought for land, for treasure, for glory. And then there are wars that are fought for the soul of the world. The war of the last alliance was such a war. It began in the year 3430 of the Second Age, when the hosts of elves and men gathered in the valley of Rivendell. They came from every corner of Middle-earth, from Lindon in the west, where the sea winds whispered of ancient days, from Lothlorien, where the golden leaves of the Malorn trees shone even in winter, from Mirkwood, where the trees had begun to darken under the shadow, and from the kingdoms of men, Arnor and Gondor, where the descendants of Númenor stood ready to honor their oaths. At the head of the elven host was Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, clad in silver armor that gleamed like starlight. In his hand he bore Eglos, the spear of ice, a weapon forged in the First Age and tempered in the blood of Morgoth's servants. Beside him rode Elrond, bearing the banner of the star and the silver tree, and behind them came the warriors of the elves, tall and grim, their eyes filled with the memory of sorrows too deep for mortal understanding. At the head of the host of men was Elendil the tall, wielding Narsil, the sword that would one day be broken and reforged as Anduril, the flame of the west. Beside him rode his sons, Isildur and Anarion, and behind them came the soldiers of Gondor and Arnor, men who had seen their homeland drowned, who had nothing left to lose and everything to defend. Together they marched east. The journey was long and perilous. They crossed the misty mountains, where the paths were narrow and the cold bit deep. They passed through the lands that Sauron had already claimed, where the earth was scorched and the rivers ran foul. They saw villages burned, forests withered, fields turned to ash. Everywhere they went, the mark of the enemy was upon the land. But they did not turn back. For 7 years, the war raged. The armies of the last alliance met the forces of Mordor upon the plains of Dagorlad, the battle plain. It was a place of no beauty, no life, only dust and stone, and the bones of those who had fallen in earlier wars. And there, beneath a sky darkened by smoke and ash, the greatest battle of the age was fought. The clash of armies was like the breaking of thunder. The orcs of Mordor came in waves, shrieking and howling, their blades black with poison, their armor wrought in the image of their master's malice. Behind them came the trolls, hulking and brutal, swinging clubs that could shatter stone. And above them wheeled the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, those 9 kings of men who had been enslaved by the rings of power and now served Sauron as his most terrible servants. But the alliance did not break. The elves fought with a grace and fury that no mortal could match. Their swords sang as they struck. Their arrows flew in clouds, each one finding its mark. Gil-galad stood at the center of the line, his spear a blur of light, and wherever he went, the enemy fell back. The men fought with the desperation of those who knew that this was their last chance. Elendil's voice rang out above the din of battle, calling his soldiers forward, rallying them when they faltered. Isildur and Anarion led charges that broke the orcish lines again and again, their swords red with the blood of the enemy. For days the battle raged. The dead piled high. The plains of Dagorlad became a charnel field, a place of horror and despair. But slowly, inch by inch, the alliance drove the forces of Mordor back. At last, the armies of the Shadow broke and fled, retreating into Mordor itself to the fortress of Barad-dûr. And the alliance followed. The siege of Barad-dûr lasted 7 years. 7 years of unrelenting war, of skirmishes and sorties, of starvation and suffering. The forces of the alliance encircled the Dark Tower, cutting off all supply, all reinforcement. They built ramparts and trenches, fortifications that stretched for miles around the base of the tower. They waited and they watched and they fought. Sauron did not come forth. He remained within his fortress, hidden, watching through the eye that burned at the summit of Barad-dûr. He sent his servants out to harass the besiegers, to wear them down, to break their will. But the alliance held, yet the cost was terrible. In the south, Anarion, beloved son of Elendil, was slain by a stone hurled from the walls of Barad-dûr. His death was a blow from which Gondor would never fully recover, a wound that would echo down through the ages. In the camps of the Alliance, disease and despair began to spread. The soldiers were weary, their supplies dwindling, their hope fading. Some began to whisper that the siege was futile, that Sauron could not be defeated, that they should retreat and seek peace while they still could. But Elendil and Gil-galad did not waver, and in the 7th year of the siege, Sauron came forth. He emerged from the gates of Barad-dûr clad in black armor, towering and terrible, his presence like a weight upon the world. The very air seemed to darken around him. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and in his hand, upon his finger, burned the One Ring. The forces of the Alliance fell back in terror, but Elendil and Gil-galad did not flee. They stood together at the foot of Mount Doom, where the shadows were deepest and the air itself seemed to writhe with malice. And there they faced Sauron. The battle that followed is remembered in song and legend, though few witnessed it and fewer still survived to tell the tale. Gil-galad's spear struck true, piercing Sauron's armor, burning him with the light of the stars. Elendil's sword, Narsil, flashed like lightning, cutting deep into the Dark Lord's flesh. But Sauron was mighty beyond measure. He struck down Gil-galad, and the High King fell, his light extinguished forever. He cast Elendil to the ground, and the King of Men lay broken upon the stone. But even in his dying, Elendil did not falter. His hand still grasped Narsil, and as Sauron loomed over him, Elendil's son Isildur seized the broken blade. With a cry of rage and grief, Isildur struck. The blade cut through Sauron's hand, severing the finger that bore the One Ring. The ring fell, tumbling to the ground, and with it, Sauron's form was destroyed. His body collapsed, crumbling into ash and shadow. His spirit fled into the void, diminished and powerless. The war was won, but the victory was hollow. Elendil and Gil-galad were dead. The greatest of the elves and the noblest of men had fallen. Their bodies were laid to rest upon the slopes of Mount Doom, and their deeds were sung in sorrow. And the One Ring lay upon the ground unclaimed. Elrond, who had fought beside the kings, came to Isildur. He saw the ring, and he knew its power. He begged Isildur to destroy it, to cast it into the fires of Mount Doom, where it had been forged and where it could be unmade. But Isildur refused. He claimed the ring as weregild, as payment for the death of his father and his brother. He looked upon it and saw not a tool of evil, but a treasure, a weapon, a thing of beauty. And though Elrond warned him, though he pleaded, Isildur would not listen. He took the ring, and with it he carried the seed of his own doom. The alliance disbanded. The surviving elves returned to their realms, weary and grieving. The men of Gondor and Arnor returned to their cities to rebuild and to mourn. The Second Age was ending. The Third Age was about to begin. And in the shadows, though his body was destroyed and his power broken, Sauron's will endured. For the One Ring had not been destroyed, and as long as it remained, he could never be truly defeated. The war was won, but the shadow was not vanquished. For evil in Tolkien's world does not die. It waits. The Second Age ended not with a triumph, but with a whisper. It ended with the slow fading of light, the retreat of the elves into hidden places, the dwindling of the great kingdoms of men. It ended with the One Ring lost in the waters of the Anduin, where Isildur had been slain by orcs in the 3rd year of the Third Age. It ended with the memory of Númenor fading into legend, into myth, into a dream half forgotten. The world changed. The elves, who had borne the weight of so many wars, began their long withdrawal. They built no new kingdoms, raised no new cities. They dwelt in places like Rivendell and Lothlorien, where time moved differently, where the beauty of the elder days was preserved like a flower pressed between the pages of an ancient book. They sang their songs, they remembered their dead, and they waited for the time when they would sail into the west and leave Middle-earth forever. The men of Gondor and Arnor ruled still, but their glory was diminished. The bloodline of Númenor ran thin. The white tree in Minas Anor withered and died, and though a seedling was found and planted, it was a pale shadow of what had been. The cities of the exiles stood, yes, but they were quieter now, less bright, less certain of their purpose. The Second Age had been an age of wonder, of the forging of the rings, of the rise and fall of Númenor, of the last alliance and the defeat of Sauron. But it was also an age of loss, of sorrow, of lessons learned too late and paid for in blood. And beneath it all, beneath the silence and the fading, the ruins of the past whispered their secrets. In the depths of the sea, where no light penetrated, the towers of Númenor still stood, broken, yes, but not entirely gone. Fish swam through the halls where kings had feasted. Seaweed clung to the stones of temples where the faithful had once prayed. And in the silence of the abyss, the memory of the downfall lingered like a curse. Sailors, in later ages, would speak of strange lights beneath the waves. They would tell stories of ghostly cities glimpsed through the water, of voices heard on windless nights, of a sorrow so deep it seemed to rise from the ocean itself. The Númenorians were gone, yes, but their shadow remained. On land, too, the echoes of the Second Age persisted. The Palantiri, the seeing stones, remained in the towers of Gondor and Arnor, though their use became rare and perilous. The shards of Narsil were kept in Rivendell, a reminder of the valor of Elendil and the tragedy of Isildur. The 9 rings given to men had long since enslaved their bearers, turning them into the Nazgul, wraiths bound to Sauron's will, neither living nor dead, forever hungering for the power they had lost. The 7 rings given to the dwarves had been reclaimed by Sauron or lost in the depths of the earth, where dragons guarded them in their hoards. And the 3 rings, the elven rings, remained hidden, wielded in secret by Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan the Shipwright, preserving the last remnants of beauty in a world that was slowly fading. And the 1 ring, it lay in the mud of the Anduin, lost and forgotten, waiting. For the ring had a will of its own. It desired to return to its master. And though Sauron was diminished, though his body had been destroyed twice, once in the downfall of Númenor, once in the war of the last alliance, his spirit endured. He could not take form, not yet, but he was not gone. He was waiting, gathering his strength, rebuilding his power in the shadows of Mordor. The Third Age would be an age of twilight, an age of slow decline. The great deeds of the past would become stories, and the stories would become myths, and the myths would be half-believed at best. The Second Age would be remembered only by the elves, and even they would speak of it with sorrow rather than pride. But the echoes remained. In the blood of Aragorn, descendant of Elendil, the legacy of Númenor endured. In the wisdom of Elrond, the memory of the last alliance was preserved. In the songs of the elves, the tales of Eregion and the forging of the rings were kept alive. And in the darkness of Mordor, the eye watched and waited, knowing that the story was not yet finished. For the Second Age had not truly ended. It had only transformed. Its triumphs had become foundations. Its tragedies had become warnings. Its heroes had become legends. And its lessons, the danger of pride, the corruption of power, the inevitability of loss, would shape the fate of Middle-earth for all the ages to come. The world was dimmed, yes. The light was fading. But it was not bereft of hope. For even in the darkest times, even when all seemed lost, there were those who remembered. Those who stood against the shadow. Those who, like the faithful of Númenor, chose to honor the gift rather than reject it. And in that choice, in that defiance, the light endured. We have journeyed through the Second Age, you and I. We have witnessed its birth in the ashes of Beleriand, its flowering in the glory of Númenor, its corruption in the forging of the rings, and its ending in fire and flood. We have walked with elves and men, with kings and smiths, with heroes and traitors. We have seen the rise of beauty and the fall into ruin. And now, as we stand at the edge of this tale, we must ask, what does it mean? For Tolkien did not write his stories merely to entertain. He wrote them to reveal. To explore the deepest truths of the human condition, the longing for immortality, the temptation of power, the inevitability of loss, and the courage required to face it. The Second Age is a mirror, and in that mirror we see ourselves. We see the Númenorians who were given a paradise and could not be content, who looked upon the gift of life and saw only its ending, who gazed westward toward the undying lands and felt not gratitude but envy. They were the greatest of men, and yet their greatness became their downfall. For they could not accept the one truth that defines mortality, that death is not a curse but a gift. Tolkien understood this deeply. In his letters, he wrote of the gift of Ilúvatar, the promise that men, unlike elves, are not bound to the world forever. Elves must endure until the end of all things, watching the slow decay of beauty, the fading of light. But men are given freedom. They die, yes, but in dying, they pass beyond the circles of the world into a fate that even the Valar do not know. This is the great mystery of Tolkien's mythology, that mortality is not a punishment but a liberation. Yet the Númenorians rejected it, and in their rejection they destroyed themselves. We see, too, the smiths of a region who desired not power for its own sake, but the preservation of beauty. Celebrimbor, heir of Fëanor, sought to create works that would endure, that would slow the fading of the world. It was a noble desire, a pure desire, and yet it led him into the hands of Sauron. For the desire to preserve, unchecked, becomes the desire to control. And the desire to control is the root of all tyranny. Tolkien knew this well. He lived through 2 world wars. He saw empires rise and fall, saw ideologies promise utopia and deliver only suffering. And he understood that the greatest evils often begin with the best intentions. The One Ring is the ultimate symbol of this. It promises power, the power to heal, to protect, to set the world right. But it corrupts absolutely. Even the wise, even the good, cannot wield it without being destroyed. Gandalf refuses it. Galadriel refuses it. For they know that the desire to do good through domination is itself a form of evil. And yet, hope endures. The Second Age ends in tragedy, yes. Númenor is drowned. The rings are forged. Sauron survives, but the faithful are saved. Elendil and his sons build new kingdoms. The last alliance fights, and though the cost is terrible, they drive Sauron back. The light is diminished, but it is not extinguished. Tolkien called this eucatastrophe, the sudden, unexpected turn toward grace. The moment when, even in the darkest hour, a glimmer of hope appears. It is not a denial of tragedy. It is not a promise that all will be well, but it is a refusal to surrender to despair. For the Second Age teaches us that even when we fail, even when our pride and our folly lead us to ruin, the story does not end. The faithful endure. The memory persists. And in some distant age, perhaps, the lessons learned in sorrow will bear fruit. This is why the tale of the Second Age matters. It is not ancient history. It is not a fantasy disconnected from our world. It is a warning and a comfort, a mirror and a map. It shows us the dangers of pride, of envy, of the refusal to accept our limitations. But it also shows us the power of memory, of loyalty, of the willingness to stand against the darkness even when victory seems impossible. And so we return to the waves. Somewhere, far beneath the surface of the sea, the towers of Númenor still stand. The halls where kings once ruled are silent. The gardens where the white tree bloomed are drowned. But they are not forgotten. For as long as there are those who remember, as long as there are those who sing the songs and tell the tales, Númenor endures. Not in stone, but in story. Not in the world, but in the hearts of those who refuse to let the light die. And the One Ring, it lies in darkness waiting, but it will not wait forever. The story is not finished. The shadow remains, yes, but so does the light. And one day, in an age yet to come, the choices made in the Second Age will echo once more. For every age ends, but the shadow remains. And so, too, does the hope. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.